Okay, I'm Alan Saly. I'm on the board of the New York Region Pathwork, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here to hear this lecture by Aimee Falchuk. Aimee is a core energetic therapist and a pathworker. Now, the Pathwork, there are 258 lectures channeled by Eva Baracus. Hopefully you've read some of them, and if you need a copy, there's one over there. There's 2 lectures on sexuality, and this is the second one. And the Pathwork, though, has a very receptive attitude towards sexuality, if I can call it that. In other words, sexuality is integral to the human experience, and the Pathwork embraces sexuality and sees basically the highest possible potential in a sexual experience. That's the closest one can get in this life to a total unitive spiritual experience. And that kind of says it all. So I'd be happy to take questions about the Pathwork if you have any after the lecture, but let me turn it over to Aimee.
Cool. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. So is this on? Yeah, great. Okay. I'm nervous about this lecture, I was telling Hannah. And I'm nervous about it because for the reason why I needed to read it and for the reason why I needed to teach it, which is, my relationship with sexual energy, I think was healthiest when I was a little girl. And at some point in adolescence up until 43, my sexuality was something I used to meet a need, which was to be special. And so I didn't know I was using my sexuality. I knew that my sexuality was getting me what I needed. I didn't have a conscious idea that I was actually using it. I thought it was just an asset that was helping me get picked, be special, whatever that intention was. And when I realized that was my pattern, I shut the whole thing down. I was like, okay, if my sexuality can only be represented as a tool to get a need met, to use, to seduce, to be special, then I'm not participating in this sexual energy. And so I just shut it down. And it worked really well because I shut it down. So it was like non-online, non-functional. And while it worked for me in terms of not getting me into trouble, it shut down the sexual energy. It shut down my life force, essentially. So it dimmed my whole experience of life. And it wasn't until I started to feel the effects of that dis-ease of shutting down a current of our life force, the creative force, that I realized, okay, I need to come back to sex and sexuality and try to get a sense of where this all went offline, went off the rails, and come back to a healthy state of sexual expression and sexuality. So I'm nervous about it because there's am I ready to give this lecture? Should you believe anything I say if I'm just at the front door? If I'm just at the entry point of really starting to look at this, maybe I'm a little further along. So I'm walking this with you. My intellect allows me to understand the lecture and I think present to you something that is valid and worth your time. But on an experiential level, I'm kind of with all of you on this. And so I guess, maybe this is a qualifier, or maybe this is just begging for your indulgence as we kind of go through this process. So what I love, and I always say about these lectures, is it doesn't quite matter what the topic is. The cause of suffering and the path to healing is the same. And so whether we're talking about sexual energy, or we're talking about God energy, or we're talking about, the masculine and feminine principles, the activating receptive principles, we're pretty much still talking about how do we get to a state of being where our energy is just in flow, whatever that energy current is. Right, so this lecture starts by saying something like, the aim of all split off beings is to come back to unity. I'm paraphrasing, right? But the whole idea is that, we might come into life, for the most part in flow, and then we meet life, frustration, trauma, pain, abandonment, not enough of our needs being met, getting shut down, and our energy starts to do different things. It flatlines, it may peak, it might flow and then get disrupted, and then flow and then get disrupted. It may be undercharged where there's never really a high vibration, right? So these energy currents essentially is how we're all walking around in the world. And these energy currents are filled with like distorted thinking. They're filled with sort of literally our physical bodies are contorted, held back, sort of collapsed. They're experienced in our emotional life, maybe where we don't allow a lot of feeling, or maybe we sort of have erratic feelings, changes in feelings. We might be totally flat. We may be fine, and then boom, something happens and we react, and then we're fine, and then boom, and we react. So this is showing up in our body and in our mind and in our feelings, and certainly in our relationships. So essentially the task, the human task for us is to sort of awaken to the fact that our energy is split, and to come home, to come back to the state of flow, which in this lecture is called total fusion. We're going to get to the sex part soon. Promise. Oh, okay. I thought, in case I cry. And total fusion is described as integration. It's described as unity, wholeness. Sort of our consciousness, sort of it gets to experience. They explained it as the experience of our eternal existence. Like this timelessness that our egos have no clue we can feel. This is total fusion, right? This is sort of not fusion. This is the opposite of that, right? This is sort of fragmentation and inconsistency and stagnation, dis-ease, right? This is total fusion. And self-actualization, this lecture says that self-actualization is not what we, our self-help books deem self-actualization. Self-actualization is actually total fusion. It's this sort of almost enlightened state of unity, okay? So to reach total fusion, you have to go through a process which the guide calls harmonious fusion, okay? And that's to look at each part of our being, which includes the physical, so our bodies, the emotional, the mental, the will, or the ego, and the spiritual. And that if we can develop each of these aspects of ourself, and by develop I mean if we can, the lecture uses the word purify, and I know a lot of us aren't comfortable with that word, but if we can sort of work through the distortions that exist on each of these levels, that we can reach total fusion, regardless of what the issue is, right? So we're going to move into the idea that we're talking about sex and sexuality, and we're going to use this framework to get there. But harmonious fusion is essentially sort of working our way either up or down, whichever direction we go in, to get to that total fusion. And in this lifetime, you might only work on one of these, right? So the idea is like, oh, I have to reach total fusion, I got to work on this and this and this. Like, there's not a lot of time in life, right? So you might just be here to work on your distortions in the physical body, right? You might just be here to sort of deal with self-will, like how to either charge your will or how to let go. And so I appreciated that in the lecture, because I think there's all this pressure of like, I got to reach total fusion, I have to reach spiritual awakening, I have to reach, I'm like, but I also have to like go eat something, and I have to sleep, and I kind of want to go to the beach, and how do I do that? And so I was sort of comforted by the fact that like we get to come back and do this again and again and again. And so maybe this lifetime, there's one or two or three or just one of these that is your work. So, as we go through this lecture, feel into like, where is that place for me? Is it in my physical body? Is it about my emotional? Is it about love for me? Is it my thoughts? Is it my will in my ego? Just feel into like, where do you feel like my task lies in this lifetime or right now? Okay? So, this exists in our sexuality. So does this. And the work we have to do to sort of move in our sex and sexuality to flow is the same process. And that's what this lecture is about, is it goes through, doesn't really talk about the will and ego, but it goes through each of these aspects from the lens of sex and sexuality, and says, when we are in distortion in any of these, the sexual experience is going to be diminished. Even if it's like, and when we're talking about the it's like genital sex or we're talking about actual sex, even if it's like great sex, you know, it's somehow the full experience of it, the reaching that spiritual fusion, that unity can't really happen unless we are sort of developed across the board in these aspects of the self. And so we're going to go over what distortions lie in each of these and see if it resonates with you. We can talk about them. If there are others that aren't in the lecture, I hope you'll bring them forward. But that's the task for this evening. How's that sound so far? Good? Okay. All right. Any questions so far? Anything not make sense yet? Can I erase this? Are you guys, yeah? Okay. So how does the guide describe sexual energy? Anyone? How does it describe the current of sexual? I'll tell you. I read it. It calls it a powerful creative force. Like it is the source of creativity, which makes sense because if you think about, you know, sex, you know, reproductive sex, you know, as and you know, being in part meant to reproduce. I mean, that's creation, right? So this is sort of, you know, to help. One thing I wanted to say before we started is that like sex and sexuality is a daunting subject, and I have no expertise in it. And like if you go into a bookstore and there's like everyone's talking about sex and they have different views of it and different opinions and the spirituality of it, and I was like, shit, excuse me, I just read the lecture, I got a lecture on this. And what I realized is like, yes, it's big, yes, it's like a topic for the ages, but if we simplify it by saying it's our creative life force, it's the energy that draws us towards creation, well then you kind of don't have to be an expert on sex to talk about it. Right? So I was like, oh, thank God. You know, like let's normalize it in a way where it's, you know, it's potent because it's, again, it is the energy that draws us towards creating, and creation is powerful. Whether it's the creation of a planet, whether it's the creation of a human being, whether it's the creation of a relationship, whether it's the creation of a passion, whether it's the creation of this room, it's like, it's powerful. Okay? So sexual energy is a powerful creative force. That's the definition we're working with tonight. Does that work for everyone? Yeah? Okay. It can manifest on the human plane as like sex, but that's not the only manifestation of it. Okay, so that's the other thing that's important. It's not just like you and someone else, or you and yourself, or you and many others in terms of engaging in the act of sex. It's bigger than that. It's energy towards creation. Okay, so just to offer that. So on the physical plane, the guide offers examples of where we might be in distortion. And the first thing it talks about is attraction. So I have clients who come to me and say, I don't know why I'm attracted to like these awful people, but I'm so drawn to them. There's something that just pulls me towards them. There's something that, or they might say, I'm not attracted to this person at all. Like they wear the wrong shoes, they, you know, like the eye closes sometimes, like the hair is parted the wrong way, you know, and they're good, they're nice people, but it's like, boy, that's judgmental. There's this sort of worry about why am I attracted to one person? Why am I not attracted to the other? And what the guide says is oftentimes when we're not conscious, our attractions are not actually even about the other person. We are projecting an image or an illusion or an idealized idea of who the other person is. And if they meet that, great. And if they don't meet that, there's resentment and there's anger and there's frustration, right? So when we're attracted to someone who is not good for us, like that when my clients say, why am I attracted to people that aren't nice to me, right? Oftentimes there's what we call the repetition compulsion, right? There's this like, there's some transferential, there's some way in which that person represents a story for this person. And this time they're going to win. This time I'm going to get that one.
Like a parent figure?
Like a parent figure. And the guide says that, often a parent figure. In a good way and not such a good way, right? I'm gonna find the good daddy, I'm gonna find the good mommy, I'm gonna find the bad daddy and win him over this time, I'm gonna find the bad mommy and win her over, fill in the blank, right? So unconsciously, we are drawing ourselves towards the place where we get to repeat a part of our history that we want to be different, as an example. Or we may not be drawn to someone because A, they don't fit the part of our parental figure, or they don't fit the idealized image of who we need that other person to be. And in that way, the other person completely is denied. It's like as if they don't exist, right? And so you can see where, how can you have a sort of decent physical experience with someone who you aren't even willing to see for who they are? So attraction, there can be a lot of distortions in attraction based on sort of our idealized image of the other. And our need to repeat something for the sake of having it be different. Okay? Does that make sense to everyone? Yeah? Okay. The second thing that the guide talks about with regard to distortions in the physical is this notion of mutuality. And essentially, this is the distinction between child consciousness and adult consciousness. So in the child-parent relationship, do you think the child is in the role of giving or receiving?
Receiving.
Okay. And the parent, are they in the role of giving or receiving?
Giving.
Right. Okay. So one gives and the other just receives. Like a baby drinking milk from its mother's breast, great example. Just, they have to do some work, but they're getting it, right? So if we remain in our child consciousness, we might look for partners where someone's the giver and the person gets to be the receiver. There's a certain passivity in that person. There's a certain sort of taking in that person. There's a certain, there's a distortion of the feminine energy in that person, right? So the guide says that we need to move from our child consciousness into our adult consciousness where mutuality is possible. Because when you have two adults and they're relatively emotionally healthy, is there a give and take of giving and receiving?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And can you see how that might be different in a sexual relationship when there's someone who only gives and only receives versus someone who gives and receives and the other gives and receives? So we have to move from the child consciousness to the adult consciousness in order to evolve in the realm of the physical. And that can be really painful because the child sort of has to give up the parent and feel that separation, feel the pain of growing up, right? So this isn't just like, I should, give and receive. It's like, no, you got to work through the loss of the parent. You have to grow yourself up here. So this is playing out on the physical realm in a sexual relationship, as an example. And it's places that we have to look at. So both the attraction, right? Are we posing an idealized image onto our partner? Are we finding partners that simply represent that parent figure and we're just playing that out and we're not seeing the partner for who they are? And are we still in our child consciousness where we're not in a give and take relationship? Okay? So the next layer is the emotional. And in an emotional connection, as it relates to sex, it's a sharing of feelings. So if I refuse to reveal myself to you or to a partner, how successful am I going to be in sharing my feelings in a sexual relationship with them? Probably not much. I might have a really great physical experience with them, right? But the depth with which I can share something with them is going to be limited because I am unwilling to be vulnerable. I'm unwilling to reveal myself. I'm unwilling to see my partner's needs. All I'm concerned about is my demands of my partner. My ego, my demands, my needs, like I need that person to be who I need them to be. That's not love. And the emotional level is really based on our capacity for love. And as much as I love all of you, most of you, including myself, don't have a great capacity for love all the time. And it's not because you're not actually capable. It's because we've been so hurt that we don't even quite know what love is and the experience of it. So we have to do our work to be able to get to a place of love, which means like addressing our demands, which means being willing to surrender our pride and be vulnerable, which means being willing to look at another person and say, like, I see your potential, I see who you are. And even though it's not ideal, you're not measuring up to the parent figure, like, I see you and I love you. And we don't have a lot of that. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to say none of you are capable of love. I realized I said that, I was like, wow, that's, I didn't mean it. I didn't mean it as a criticism. I don't know half of you. I meant it more as a human race. Like love sometimes can feel really elusive. We feel it in these moments, and then it slips away, and our ego takes back over, and our wounds take back over. So I would clarify that. So in the emotional space, it's really about humility. It's about sharing. It's about revealing, seeing the other, allowing yourself to be seen. It's about, sort of understanding your demands and understanding what your actual real needs are. How many people know the difference between, or sense they have a difference between their demands in their relationship and their needs?
I think I do, yeah.
You do?
Yeah.
Yeah. If you're willing, what's a demand you place in your relationships?
A demand will be to be satisfied in the way that I want to be satisfied. You know, but in a need will be basic. It's a necessity. That is a need that's essential. That's needed, and. Yeah, so that's the way I see it. The demand is something that I would want from that person to give me, just because I feel that I want that, and that is going to feel like a void in me.
If you don't have it.
If I didn't have it,
Yeah.
contrary to a necessity,
Yeah.
which would be like something like naturally needed.
Yes.
Yeah.
And thank you. And our demands, going back to this idea of child consciousness, our demands often come from the child in us. And children get to make demands. They're kids. They haven't quite learned sort of that boundary yet, right? But as adults, we have to know that we're making demands. And we have to sort of see the impact those demands are having in our relationships, including our sexual relationships.
But can't a need be expressed as a demand? So it means it doesn't need to be separate. It's just there's a need, but we see it as a demand. But actually, I don't see it's two different things.
Yeah, a demand may be something like, you have to call me every 5 minutes, and you need to check in with me, and you need to make sure. And you need to not be with anyone else, and you need to keep all your attention on me. What do you think the need is underneath that?
Security.
Sorry?
Security.
Yeah. That could be one. Right? So, and what's the impact? If we're in a relationship and I make those demands of you, do you want to meet those needs? Does it make you want to come closer to me or kind of go far away?
Depends how I can see it. Depends if I can be in touch with your need. Yeah.
Right. Right. I mean, if there's consciousness, you can see beneath it, right? And demands often don't come that explicitly. The demands are more subtle. But, underneath our demands are a real need, but it's up to us to identify what that need is. So if I'm yelling at you if I'm asking, essentially what I'm asking you for is reassurance. Do you still love me? Are you still here? Right? So underneath that is some need for security, some need for a sense of like, I'm okay. And that might be something I need to give myself first in a way that I can then be in a relationship with you, or I don't push you away because it becomes a demand. So I think to your point is they don't necessarily need to be separated, but they need to be understood of like, what's the real need underneath the demand? And how in an emotional exchange can you communicate that need so that the other person, to the extent that they want to or responsible, can meet that, can support you in meeting it. Okay? So that's a big piece of kind of the development of our emotional kind of existence in our sexuality and our sexual relationships, is to out what our demands are and identify what the needs are underneath. And then be willing to communicate that need to your partner, whoever you're in relationship with.
Yeah. Would it be fair to say that the higher self tends to see past or through demands and gets to see a little bit more of recognize the real needs then that the other person may be just trying to display?
Yeah, but again, I think it's about how conscious is that other person. It's like, it's like how triggered do you get in the demand? And if you're triggered, then whether your higher self sees it or not, you might not be able to deal with it. But you may also, if you know the person and have a sense of yourself, you can say, okay, I know this part of you. This is really about your insecurity. And how can I make you feel safe? How can you make yourself feel safe? But a lot of us may not talk to each other that way. Yeah. Okay, any other questions on this? Each of these are like a lifetime of study. So what I'm doing is just pulling out the pieces in the lecture that sort of mention where the distortions exist on these planes of existence. So, it's going by fast, but these are obviously things that you could just take and study on your own and talk more about, but I just want to highlight them, okay? Yeah.
Can I ask one more
Yeah.
question? So, like when you use the word consciousness, like on one side we use it as like awareness, but when you say like child consciousness and adult consciousness, is it like the belief system, or what is it you're more talking?
Yeah, so, the guide often talks about child consciousness as sort of ego consciousness, and ego is filled with, and child consciousness is filled with distortions, feelings, experiences, a body, right? So in that state of development, in that sort of less evolved, less mature state of being, where there's a lot of duality, it's a lot of me or you, it's a lot of all or nothing, it's a lot of life or death. So that's the consciousness of the child. That's the consciousness of the ego, but that's the consciousness of the child. And so the work is about, when we did that lecture 75, like the work is about sort of working through the ego state of consciousness, meeting the lower self that's like, eek, I know I have to move out of this, but I don't want to. And then surrendering a healthy ego to the unitive state. And that's essentially what we're talking about here. It's the same path. It's like, how do I move from that distorted state of thinking, being, feeling, holding, and move into that more conscious, awake, open place, unitive place. Consciousness is also a tricky word. All these words are tricky, right? And they're used by different people in different ways. The lecture is pretty consistent with these words, and so I use them as the lecture defines them. How's everyone doing? They're like, wow, this is the most exciting sex conversation I've ever had. Why was sexuality and spirituality sort of separated for so long? Like, why was it sort of deemed that you had to shut down the impulses of sexuality in order to reach a spiritual? And it was because in sexuality, there's a lot of negativity. There's a lot of darkness around sort of power and, brutality and, submission and all this stuff. And that's not spirituality. That's, you know, and we didn't have the consciousness or the conscience or the container to be able to deal with the negativity. So we just shut it off so that we could have a spiritual experience. But in reality, addressing the negativity is the path to spirituality. That's where the spiritual awakening comes. That's the work. And that's why this lecture is called The Spiritual Significance of Sexuality. Because if sexuality holds all this distortion and negativity and brutality and our darkness and our all this stuff, then if we can travail through it, if we can work through it and process it, that's the way to fusion. Otherwise, it's spiritual bypass.
Yeah.
I mean, so you know, we are on, to some extent, maybe we aren't, maybe I'm being naive, but we are perhaps conscious enough and we have the container enough to be able to do the work of the lower self. And doing that is what leads to total fusion, which is the spiritual awakening. So we can't not use sexuality, not use, bad word for me. We can't not address sexuality if we're on a spiritual path. You have to.
Right. But that fusion, that state of fusion, is it only within the sexual act with a partner, loving partnership, or can it just be tantric experience, any sexual experience while you align the other, you know, where you clean up and pierce through and really bring light to all these other aspects and clean them up? Couldn't you even reach it within yourself?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, the guide says that the sexual force is consciousness reaching for fusion. It doesn't say sexual energy is people having sex and therefore, I mean, like, it can include that. But it's the creative force reaching for fusion. Total fusion is having the experience of our eternal existence. So if you want to get there this way, that way, the other way, like, go for it. But the goal is total fusion. And the way to get to total fusion is to address our distortions. It's to move through our child consciousness. It's to allow the feelings to move. It's to open the energy, right? It's to sort of break through the places where we're holding back. It's to go through the lower self. That's what every lecture is about. Every lecture is the same path, regardless of the topic. And so, you know, this is just through the lens of the sexual force. And to be reminded that the guide says, you might only get to do one aspect of the self this go around. You know? Maybe it's the physical, maybe it's the emotional, maybe it's the mental, maybe it's the will.
But the physical is not connected with the body. These are those things you were describing.
I'm sorry?
My
I didn't hear
parents. The physical doesn't really have to do with the body. Like, I love my body, I'm in a great shape.
It certainly does. I mean, the lecture doesn't talk about this, but certainly there are distortions in one's sense of their body that absolutely affects the sexual relationship, right? If there's a certain modesty, or I have shame around nudity, or I literally have a contraction in my body that I can't loosen up to actually have. I mean, that's a whole, right. That's not in this lecture, but it's like, that's an absolute reality.
Got it, thank you.
And I know, like, you two are studying this, have studied this and are doing this, and like, if you want to speak to any of this, or you guys should talk to them, they're smart. Just about the physical piece of it, you know, just the blocks, like, you know, core energetics, which is separate from pathwork, but or part of pathwork. You know, we look at the energetic blocks in the physical body, you know, and when we're talking about sex and sexuality, there are certainly parts of the body that, if they're contracted, if they're blocked, if they're closed for business, you know, it's going to have an effect in the sexual realm.
Sure.
Whether it's you on your own or whether it's you with someone else or others. Yeah.
When you said those words to me about how can I make you feel safe and how can you make yourself feel safe, okay, those resonated very strongly with me, and thank you first. But on the subject of the physical, as you were talking, it just kept going through. See, my problem right now, at least from what I'm seeing in my relationships, is on the emotional level, and so that I feel drawn to that area to work on that. Mm-hmm. But it can apply to the physical just the same way.
Sure.
Those exact words that you said were quite revolutionary because they were simply stated.
Yeah.
But if I'm not comfortable in my own physical body, how can I make someone else feel that or
Yeah.
connect with that aspect
Yeah.
of themselves. I might just suck it away from them in a lot of ways.
Or maybe you have a mask that can sort of pretend, but at the end of the day, you know, sort of that you're not really having that experience.
Right. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Okay. So the next level is mental. And this is if the emotional level is about a sharing of experience and a sharing of feelings, the mental is sharing of ideas and intellect. And I used to my attractions never seemed to be based on physicality. If you put like all the men I was attracted to in line, they'd be like, I'm sorry, what? I mean, like every shape and size. Like, okay. Like there was, but like their intellect, I was just like, I was drawn into it. And I have done work to understand why. I have had a father who just was brilliant. And I would connect with him through intellect. And I would be so excited to come home and he'd just tell us shit and we'd be like, oh my God, I don't even know what he was saying half the time, but it was just like he's talking and he sounds smart and he's dad. And so like in my repetition compulsion, I went to that sort of brilliant guy. And I got a little messed up there because in these men's brilliance and in my father's brilliance, there were some distortions in emotion, right? And by the way, my own reliance on intelligence was a reflection of my own distortions on the emotional plane. So I found I found myself, right? But so this was an area where I sort of am curious about. Like you said, you're curious about the emotional, I'm curious about the mental. But in the lecture, it says where we go wrong in terms of mental sharing is when we're afraid to speak up because we think if we do, somehow our partner's going to leave. So we withhold our thoughts. We might be agreeable when we actually are disagreeable about something because we want to avoid conflict or confrontation. We might not share our beliefs about something because we're afraid we're going to be too big or someone's going to leave, like they'll think I'm crazy. So there's a withholding of your own thoughts and ideas for the sake of maybe maintaining connection. And then resentment builds because you're not really sharing yourself. You're just agreeing with someone all the time so that they stay with you, right? So we have to look at the places where am I in relationship and I withhold what I think, or I agree to not have to disagree, or I disagree because that's a way to bring negativity out without really having to deal with it. So I'll just fight with the person all the time about politics. When in reality, what I really want to do is like punch them in the face because I'm so angry that they're distant or that they're not hearing me, right? So we can look at where sort of we are not engaging on an intellectual mind level, and how that's affecting the contact, how that's affecting the relationship. The other part of the mental piece is our images, and I don't know if any of you have read those lectures on images, but they're good to read.
40, 41, 42.
Thank
43.
you. Yep.
Over and over.
Yes.
Again.
Yes. I mean, if I were to ever do a workshop on sexuality, I would sort of begin and end with images, right? Like, what are your images of sex? What are your images of the creative life force? What are your images about your body? What's your images about another person's body? Like, did anyone grow up with a very specific or implied message about sex?
Yeah, Catholic religion, huge.
What was the image? I mean, what was the message you got?
It's a taboo.
Uh-huh.
Don't go there.
Mm-hmm.
It's dirty.
Mm-hmm.
You are sinning even when you masturbate.
Mm-hmm.
It's dirty. It's ugly. Don't go there. It's a taboo.
Okay.
It is no fun. And you can be punished for having that
Oh,
pleasure.
yes.
Yeah.
You will burn internally in hell.
And what did you do with that? How did that manifest in your life?
That's a good question. I think a lot of guilt about just expressing sexually, but then on the other hand, a great desire to be fulfilled sexually, so picking partner just based on sexual attraction, just because they're going to be fantastic in bed and satisfy me. And then just shutting down all the other channels because sex is so great, why the hell will I leave? Knowing that this has no way of going anywhere, because emotionally and in other areas, I mean, intellectually I was just like you, it has to be intellectually always a partner, but I was just picking with my pussy rather than with my brain or my heart. And then devastated, completely heartbroken when it turns out that this is my mother on the top of everything else, in a great lover's body, because it's got, and I want to win them all over again, but they're narcissistic, emotionally unavailable, and controlling. So those kinds of things. Fear of commitment. Just not expressing the sexuality in a very healthy, loving way to the degree that I would have liked to, because having those early experiences of great sex, but then complete heartbreak just shuts you down. So you don't want to go there again because you're heartbroken, you're shattered.
Yeah. Right.
So you shut down sexually and you push away God, men.
And you can see how then, on the emotional level, that I won't love again, I won't let someone in, I won't make that commitment, I won't feel that pain again.
Yeah, and I won't be like my mother.
Yeah.
I won't be like my mother also, who basically didn't have a great sexual life.
Right. So the protest that happens, sounds like for you, in the sexual realm is about the images that you received growing up about it. It's about the heartbreak. It's about your relationship with your mother, right? So one can see the value of just exploring your sexual experiences or your images around sexuality leads you to the work, leads you to your work about allowing heartbreak and still showing up in the face of it.
Yeah.
About getting real with what's the truth actually? Is sex bad? Is it sinful? And potentially healing the relationship with your mother, at least within yourself.
Yeah, that's the hard part.
So all that information you get by just asking the question, hey, what was your image about sex?
Yeah.
Thank you. Anyone else just want to share an image or a belief or a message they got about?
I would say I came from a large family that the message was there's no such thing as sex.
Oh.
No such thing. Because there were males and females siblings, so of course you had to say it didn't exist because we were all living together in
Right.
some space. Even the word, maybe this was dramatic, sex was not mentioned. If you said the word sex, you said a dirty word. So nobody used the word.
So you also got the message then it was either non-existent or dirty.
Well, completely non-existent because it was dirty.
Because it was
and
dirty.
you didn't talk about going to the bathroom either.
Right.
So fit
Right.
right into that category.
Right. So what I would say about that is on some level the distortion then becomes in the physical realm. Because if your family doesn't even talk about going to the bathroom, it sounds like there's some shaming, some embarrassment, some denial of their humanity. Because it sounds like you had a lot of siblings, so I'm guessing sex happened. Because somehow your siblings got there.
At least 8 times.
At least 8 times. Right. I heard about a stork once, but I'm guessing that sex happened. And I'm also guessing that you all went to the bathroom.
Yeah.
Okay, got it.
I'm also guessing that, and this may be just my specific thing, but that my mother had a major problem with sex, and it wasn't that it was dirty. It was the reverse, because the reason she had 8 kids is because it was her desire and fulfilling desire. Now this is my interpretation, that made her not let her children have any connection with it, because that would make it too obvious, I guess.
So it was her, so you're saying it was her guilt or shame about pleasure and desire?
Her own pleasure and her own desire. Yeah. Maybe unusual, I don't know.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah.
And yet again, it's like there's something about the physical, the humanness of the things you're talking about, like sex and going to the bathroom, that feels like if those things were denied, you know, like why? What's the shame around them? What's the, you know, what's the story behind that? And is it true for you?
No, it's not true for me. Well, I mean, it probably has its,
right.
repercussions, I'm not saying that.
Right.
But I've worked on it a
Yeah.
long time
Yeah.
to get to that place.
Yeah.
I just bring it up in case anybody else had that denial
Yeah.
of the physicality, of being physical.
Yeah. Does anyone have that experience? Yeah, you had that
Yeah, I
experience?
was raised in a kind of, I feel very similar to what you
Kevin,
stated.
I knew it would be.
Yeah, I felt very similar
Large
to what you
family.
said. Large family, and exactly a mother who also, very much later in life, I learned more about her finally. After all that, you know, exterior shell went away, when she got more, I guess, open about it and vulnerable, okay, after the hard shell. But yes, it was a lot of pleasure. It was a large family. I'm the youngest of 7. It didn't really exist as I was a child through my preteen years, definitely. And then suddenly, I'm left in the preteen years being like not able to communicate with girls at that time and having humiliating experiences, not sexually, but guess what? It ended up
Yeah.
becoming part of my sexuality because that was the only way that I could link those two items.
Yeah.
The humiliation of not being able to have contact verbally, emotionally with a woman at the time, being shut off, and then portraying that aspect of it, that sexual gratification in a humiliating kind of way.
Yes.
Now, if you would ask me, am I masochistic? No, because I don't seek to be humiliated by women, but rather there's a sense of that connection still there, where you may not be seeking it, but it's still
Yeah.
there. It's still underneath it all, you know, the butterflies, or whatever
Yeah.
you want to call it. There's like a
Yeah.
ton of ways you could look at it.
Absolutely. But it sounds like you're bringing consciousness to it. And that, yeah. Yeah, thank you.
I think some of it also was timing as well. You know, I think most of the people here, when we grew up, I think it was less comfortable for parents to talk about those types of things. So you really didn't have those conversations about sexuality. I think it feels a little easier now to have those conversations.
So what was the image then that you had or belief you had about sex or sexuality?
I mean, I don't think I ever had a conversation with my parents about sex until I went away to college and my mother bought me like a pack of like 100 condoms or something like that. It was like, you know, use these.
Yeah.
That was probably the first conversation we ever had about it.
And how was that for you? When you received that from her, what was that?
It was funny, you know, we laughed about it because at that point I think she felt comfortable. But literally, you know, at the time when I was, you know, first going through any kind of sexuality, no, I mean, it was like taboo.
Yeah.
You know, you didn't talk about that
Yeah.
sort of thing.
Yeah, so it becomes this like thing, right? And it's like, why isn't it talked about? And sort of what is it about it that's not being talked about? Is it the body piece? Is it the nudity piece? Is it the dirtiness? Is it the religious piece? Is it sort of the intimacy piece, right? So going back to sort of, you know, those layers of being, like you can figure out in your family, like where did it show up most? Where did the distortion around sex and sexuality show up most? Was it in the physical? Was it in the emotional? Was it in the mental? Was it in the will? You know, was it in sort of your parents or your caregivers' sort of ideas of sex? Did it come mostly from religion and the messages you got? I have two brothers. They were very much allowed to do whatever they wanted sexually. And when my father knew that I was having sex, he wouldn't talk to me.
Wow.
And he didn't say why. He just didn't talk to me. And I was very confused because I was like, I don't get it. Like they are doing what I'm confused, you know. And what I did as in response is I tended to have sex in secret. So I'd have relationships with people and no one would know because then my father would continue to talk to me, you know. So, and in other ways, my father was a physician and, you know, he would, can I tell this story? Let me think. Yes. Okay. No. Do you want, I don't know, do you want to hear this story? Okay, so It's so inappropriate. I would get something called honeymoon cystitis. Do you know what honeymoon cystitis is? Like, I had a boyfriend who lived in another city, and so like I wouldn't have sex, and then suddenly I'd go visit him, and we'd have lots of. I'd probably get the 100 condoms that your mom gave me, have sex all the time, and then I'd get these like infections because it's like that's too much friction happening for a long time. And my father was a doctor, and I felt connected to him, so I would talk to him about it. I'd say, Dad, you know, this is happening, and he was so uncomfortable with the subject that he would only talk to me about it as if I was riding horses. What? And he'd be like, well, Aimee, see, when you ride horses and the saddle will irritate. And I remember just being, and my mom's like, please don't ask him these things. Please go to a doctor. And there was no, and it's, you know, looking back on it, the poor guy should have asked someone else. But like, he was the only one I trusted. But at first I was like, wait, I'm not riding horses. I don't have a saddle. Like, I'm confused. But his whole thing was like, if you ride a saddle too much, there's friction and that can cause infection, all this other stuff. So my point is, by telling that totally inappropriate story, is that, you know, there was no sense that it was normal and that it was okay and it was part of life and it was exciting and pleasurable, and there was just a message that it's either bad or really inappropriate. So much so that he couldn't even use the language to talk about it. He had to refer to it as sort of riding horses. And so I grew up with that. That's the message. So if you were to each do your evaluation of like, what were the messages you got implicitly and explicitly, you know, and from all the people that influenced you, I bet you like it's going to start to inform your story about how you show up in your sex and sexuality. Sorry, Dad. I'm sorry to tell that story. Did you have a question?
Yeah, I just wanted to share something. So I also like grew up very conservative, religious, whole family, a big, large, and the message was always sex is a sin, not allowed, just not even a mention, just a crime, you'll burn in hell and all that, right? So it was another country. So when I moved out from my family after like 1899, I was here, and the message from everywhere was, my friends and everywhere was, you should have a lot of sex. All the time, every night, you know, you go out, party, club, everybody's like, message was like, you should have, so this two messages was extremely conflicting,
Yes.
extremely confusing, because I was programmed until 70, 80, my family was, you will burn in it, the unspeakable horror will come to you.
Yes.
If you have sex, like, you know, you'll be outcasted, you'll be excommunicated, all that. And then here, my messages from all my friends, everybody was like, let's go party, let's pick up girl, have sex.
Yeah.
That's it. So this was this was too much conflict.
Yes.
It's just
How
a
did you deal with it?
It's like really, I don't know, it's just.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like very struggling, challenging to clean out my old program, and still challenged with that, my childhood program.
Yes.
Yeah, condition.
Yes.
So just also this message from societies, like when I was like teenager, like after like 20, yeah, you should have like friends, like yeah, every day, every night, weekends, you should go out and have sex.
Right. And what was that about for them? What do you imagine sort of the...
It was just like everybody's putting on a show, like this is the image they were trying to play, like we're like this and we should be like this and this is should be like this.
Yes. There's nothing in the lecture that says if you're having a lot of sex, you're cool. but at least in this culture, like that, you know, it may, you know, boys and girls differently, but like it's cool. Like, what do you mean you haven't had sex, or what, you know? And that's the using of sexual energy for something else, to be cool, right? To be included, to belong. When in reality, they just want to belong. And if you could separate that out and say, I would like to have sex and enjoy that experience and have that, but not use it so that I can be cool and fit in, then you're sort of, again, the word is tricky, but then you're purifying that sexual energy. You know, you're allowing it to be the sacred energy that it is, rather than abusing it and using it so that you're cool.
But as like when you're like in 20 as a guy, you always have this pressure to, like, you know, just have as much sex as you should. You're like all your friends, everybody, this is the mess, from movies, from everywhere, from everything.
Yeah.
So.
Or when you get divorced and you're in your 40s and all your friends that are married and your guy friends that are married, they're like, come on, what's going on?
Yeah.
Tell me all the stories.
Right. Right.
And then it goes
Yeah.
back to when you're in your 20s.
Yeah. But can you see how it's like, in the way that we're talking about it, it's like it's being distorted. It's becoming about something else.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know?
They want to live their fantasy through you.
Yeah.
Their fantasies, they want to live through you. It's like, oh, you're single again, so you can just go wild.
And that, thank you for saying, I mean, this is sort of, well, the lecture talks about the need to explore your sexual fantasy as a way of awakening your sexual consciousness. Because your fantasies will tell you a lot about what's happening in the non-sexual realm. You know, there's so much allowance. You know, I don't know if you fantasize about other things, but people tend to fantasize most in the sexual realm. I mean, people might daydream about other things, but there's a reason why. There's like the power of that fantasy, the power of the energy in that fantasy. And so, you know, as it says in the lecture, as an assignment, like, explore your sexual fantasies. What are they about? And you're going to find they're in the realm of one of those 5 things: emotion, mental, physical, will.
In the previous lecture, they separate, he separates up sex into, the love, sex, and eros triad. And as you were talking and sharing, and especially the 2 male sharing as well, connected to me, it made me differentiate a little bit too in that respect, and maybe I offer it too. It seems like, even though I knew my mom hid this stuff, because I went to public school, not Catholic, and that was kind of different. My eldest went to Catholic school, and so maybe they heard maybe different stuff or didn't hear as much. But for me, I knew kind of we weren't hearing it, and so I knew my mom had a problem there, okay, and that was fine. But it was more on the eros side, where emotionally connecting to a woman was challenging, and I didn't even know what was going on, but it was more on the eros side more so than just the sexual side, because once the relationship started, the sexual side was fine, the love side was fine. It just seemed more from that third leg, in a sense, that was more challenging.
Well, and in that lecture, it sort of talks about eros as like, eros is the attraction. Eros is that awakening of that sexual energy. And that sex is the bridge to love. That sex becomes the way eros gets enacted and then love gets created. But if we're having sex so that we can be cool, if we're having sex because X, Y, and Z, if we're acting out something, it's not a bridge to love.
Right, or you're pushing your emotions, which you're disconnected from, into the act.
Yes.
Because it's related, those emotions are related to a woman.
Yes.
And so therefore you're using it as kind of a surrogate.
Yes.
To really emotionally knowing your heart.
Yes.
In the process.
Yeah.
So,
I think the key word there feels be using it.
Yeah, exactly.
Using
Triggering,
it.
good word in that case.
Yeah.
I can ask one.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know if it's a question, but like one thing I'm wondering is, and it's related to my history, but I have maybe a more general question, but like for a kid, is that normal? Like what age or when is it like normal for a kid to understand, oh yeah, my parents are having sex, like they are sexual beings, and do even like parents can share about these things, like, oh yeah, we had sex last night or something. I mean, like, I know for me, like I never knew, it's like even now it's hard to imagine my parents having sex. And I don't know if it's because how close they were about it, or is it just like it's normal, so I'm just curious to hear.
I don't have an answer to that, and I would imagine I'm sure there's, from a developmental standpoint, there might be an age that would be a moment where there's a recognition. I would imagine also depends on how the parents communicate with the child about sex and sexuality and their body. I don't know. I mean, it's not my expertise. I wouldn't want to answer that. Does anyone know the answer to that? No?
Like how to share that with your kids.
Well, I think it goes to the idea of like, do they know it in themselves? The parents, My father never explained to me why he wouldn't talk to me when I was having sex. Like, why? What was his belief about it? Or what was his belief about me, that generated that? So I think the parents doing their work to say, how do I feel about this in myself, before they talk to their kids about it? Because most parents talk to their kids about it from a place of be careful, be safe, wait till you're, there's sort of these parameters that you don't hear in other aspects of life. And my sense is that's probably coming from a lot of fear in the parents about their own sex or sexuality. But I'm sorry.
And their own shame.
Yeah, their own shame.
Yeah.
I think that's, sorry.
I just wanted to offer one thing with regards to that, because as a parent, the lectures also talk about showing that pleasure, that connectedness or whatever, back early, very early, in very simple forms, whether or not it's sucking on a breast, whether or not it's taking a bath and being silly in the bathtub, or whatever. It doesn't say those words, but I get a feeling that when I read about the pleasure and the early forms of pleasure as a child, it's our constraints as parents that shut it down and make it shameful.
Yes.
And if we just acted, well, I'm not saying act naturally, you can't act naturally forcing it, but there's a natural aspect to allowing a child to be pleasurable in their own body or in their own behaviors, instead of going, oh, why are you doing that? Or don't do that, or, and then hiding things. So, yeah, it kind of all goes hand in hand.
And it goes back to where, thank you for saying that, because it goes back to where we started. It's like, if the flow of energy is what we're aiming towards, then wherever there is a disruption in that, it's going to show up in every aspect of life in some form. So if a parent denies itself pleasure, right, ideally there's pleasure in sex, right? But if they deny pleasure in themselves, like your story about your mom denying pleasure and denying desire, then how are they going to talk about sex as it relates to pleasure? Sex is going to either be mechanical, or it's going to be about being safe, or it's going to be about reproducing, or it's going to be about something else. So it's like we need to do the work so that we're in flow in all aspects of ourselves, even though, again, we may only have a chance to go through one of them, to be able to sort of, I think, even have an ideal conversation with our kids about it.
I think what resonates for me is like I never saw my dad as having pleasure in life in general.
Yeah.
And so it's like very hard for me to imagine him doing something to kind of have pleasure.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think it goes in stages a little bit as a parent. I think at first it's, letting your children see that there is love. It could be holding hands. It could be, kissing, sort of making it comfortable. I have an 8-year-old daughter. When she was 3, she started masturbating, and I was like, and she could be at like her table in the living room, and we're sitting there, and certainly it seemed unusual to me, and the way that we handled it was there was nothing wrong with it, but also knowing that there's a place to do it and sort of be a little more private. You don't want to be out in a restaurant and start doing that, right? And so have your time. But it seemed like a really bizarre conversation. Who would think that this would be happening at the age of 3? But you also didn't want to. We didn't want to deny her of doing that or make her feel bad that she was doing it. But it certainly was. It took me by surprise that it would start that early.
And all the places that sex touches, the body, the spirit, the mind, the heart, it's like if those aspects are getting hurt elsewhere, it's going to play out in the sexual realm, right? So if kids are feeling so insecure about their physical body, I'm too fat, I'm too thin, I'm not this, I'm not that, like the body is essential in sex to some extent, I'm assuming, right? It's a body experience, right? And so imagine how those feelings about oneself and one's body are going to play out in the sexual realm. So the guide says, we have to look at our non-sexual nature and see how it affects our sexual nature, and we have to look at our sexual nature and see how it affects the non-sexual, and that it's a mirror. That it's very rare you're going to find something that only exists in the sexual realm. Maybe it's the place where it's getting acted out because it's the safest. Maybe all your negativity gets acted out and you can say, oh, but I'm so good and positive and higher self in every other aspect of my life. It's like, yeah, because you're channeling all your negativity into your sexuality and your sex. So, it's where it exists one place, you're going to find it elsewhere, and that's the lecture's invitation is to like, how can I look at my sexuality and sex in a different way? How can I look at where my sex or sexuality reflects my selfishness or my cruelty or my desire to overpower or my desire to submit or my desire to take and suck or my desire to punish or my desire to withhold? Where is the sexuality, where in my sex am I, surrendering the ego? Or where am I not surrendering my ego? Like, where am I so willful? Where am I not willful at all? Where am I completely undercharged? Where am I in my pride? Where am I in my self-will? Where am I in fear? Like, all through the lens of sex and sexuality, and to start to use that as an opportunity to grow in those 5 aspects of the self, with the intention of reaching total fusion, right? But again, what's so clear about the pathwork, and why I love the pathwork, is because they say you cannot get there until you go through the lower self. So we can come up with all the images and understand why or what we do, but we ultimately are going to get to that state where we have to look at the shadow. And that's where we can reach fusion. So anyone that tells you you can't reach sexuality and spirituality, it's like, oh no, that's the transformation. Otherwise it's bypass, right? So you may hear, in this lecture, you may have heard what we talked about in the last lecture. In the last lecture, you may have heard what we said in the lecture before, and that's a good thing, right? It's making its point over and over and over again. So I've talked a lot. I want to just, open it up to people's sort of feelings about the lecture, feelings about what we talked about, anything they want to share, and then we can close.
Go through all the stages?
Yes, we went through physical, emotional. The will and the ego is not in this particular lecture, but self-will, right? Our forcing energy, our ego. Can you imagine how, if I refuse to surrender my ego, how do you think my orgasms are going to be?
You're the dominatrix.
Not good.
I'm a dominatrix in that place.
You would be the dominatrix if you come from a place of ego. You want to be very powerful.
Yes, but it's an art to distinguish between sort of pleasure and preference and finding that enjoyable, and that actually being a reflection of refusing to actually surrender the ego. So I just want to say that, and it says this in the lecture, that we don't want to. We want to allow enough space for just that's pleasurable, that's exciting for me, and it just is, versus this is a defense against something. So I'm just saying I don't know that world, so I don't want to speak to it. But you're saying that would be a place where there's a lack of surrender of the ego.
Yeah, I can imagine that if you're very egotistic. You see it all the time in corporate world, that people who are in a position of power, a lot of times they also sexual predators, so to speak, because that ego, drives them in everything, and that's also how they express sexually, because they are so used to having their way in everything and domineering that, I've encountered many sexual predators in corporate world, and especially if they were in position of power.
Yeah, and in reality, though, those people don't have a very strong ego.
They don't.
No, that's the problem.
That's
They
why
get
they
it.
dominate like that.
Yeah, I mean, their safety comes in by their power, but it's not real power, because real power you wouldn't have to dominate someone else.
Right.
So it's a weak ego, actually. But
I have a question too, when you were saying you're looking at your sexuality, your sexual fantasies, right? And let's say you are domineering, or you are submissive, or you are whatever distorted, then how do you cure that? You just keep looking at it, or what do you do with that?
I don't think we cure it. I think we sort of explore it and understand it's what are the images associated with it? What's it playing out? Is it a fantasy to have power because you don't have any power in your life? And is there a place you need to step into your power? Is it a place where you allow, in your fantasy, is it a place where you have permission to express your negativity because in your real life you can't express your negativity? Is it an erotic fantasy or an intimate fantasy? Because like there's so much shame for you to be intimate and loving, and you cut that off, but in your fantasy it's a place where you get to have it. I think the fantasy is just about, the beginnings of it is to look at how is it reflective of what either is or is not happening in life. And maybe you all can, in addition to sort of what are your images about sex, you can go home and write kind of what's a fantasy you have about it, and then start to ask questions. Make it an inquiry process. You don't have to get to any point, but just say, wow, I constantly have this fantasy where I'm being overpowered, or I am overpowering someone. It's like, okay, let me ask some questions. What's my first question about that? What's my relationship to power in my life? Sorry?
Why do I like to be overpowered?
Yeah, whatever the question, wherever it takes you. I remember, whatever that inquiry process, wherever it takes you.
I like the fact that you said that you could express negativity that you shut off in your life otherwise.
Yeah.
And that becomes the dumping ground for your shadow,
Yeah.
lower self.
Yeah. One thing I discovered in my exploration of sex was like, it was the one place I could feel hate.
Sorry?
It was the one place I felt hate.
Hate.
Permission to feel hate. I don't know why, but I felt it. Because I don't, in my life, I'm like, I can't hate anybody. I have to be a good girl. I have to be, and for some reason in the sexual experience, I like felt hate, and it felt so good. It was so pleasurable, and I don't know what their experience was like, but but because I was in so much pleasure, I'm sure they got pleasure out of that.
Oh, you acted it out?
Well, I didn't act it out in the sense of I didn't harm them, but like I felt my hate towards them. I wasn't feeling love. Yeah, let it out. It was just sort of like,
But you love the people in the room.
I don't know. I mean, sure. I'm sure at a higher, maybe, but I was allowing my hate, which was so necessary. Feeling it, like they weren't there for me to love them yet. They were gifts for me to hate. Thank you, all men in my life, for letting me hate you. Right? But I mean, it was the place because I wouldn't allow myself the expression of hate because my idealized image said, you can't hate. You have no right to hate. That was the message I got.
So how do you express that hate? Like aggressiveness, or I guess is that?
Aggression and lack of empathy. I'm going to take what I want. I don't really care if you're tired. I don't care. I mean, I don't think I violated any boundaries. I mean, I've checked in with myself, and I mean, that's important. But I expressed it. I was like, you're here for me. I don't really care what you want. I mean, it was so emotionally, there was so little, it was a place where I got to act out the hate. And thank God, because it needed to be expressed. So when you read this lecture and it says that it's consciousness reaching for fusion, with fusion being sort of this spiritual, I mean, all of a sudden it's like, wow, that's a good reason to have sex, good sex, right? Mm-hmm. But we need to sort of work through the layers of distortion that prevent us from reaching that fusion, including looking at our negativity, including looking at the places where we withhold.
Of course, I got, completely, but, when I was growing up, now I completely understand, and I know that this is one of the most beautiful energy, and really the only way, and it's the greatest way to, to transmute it and to kind of like, fuse it is through going through. I think the guys described as, binding with another consciousness,
Mm-hmm.
with another entity.
Yes.
And that, for us human here, 99% of us, unless you come reincarnate with a special mission, that's the way to do it.
Yes.
And this, this is the best way.
Yep.
So I understand that now, but then it was completely different. I grew up with our image, and it was completely distorted. So, along the way, thank God, through the lectures and everything, I was able to work it out.
Yep.
Yeah. It's been a good thing.
Yep. We come here, we get split, and the task is to come back and to reintegrate and to fuse. And so all these images, all these distortions, all these painful experiences, in some ways sort of lend to the split, which lends then to the work and our task. And that's the beauty of it. It doesn't feel beautiful when you're in it, but, that's the task at hand. Hannah, can I say that Hannah has this website called Creatrix, and it's about women and their creativity. And she asked a question about the relationship between creativity. I think it was like, what's the relationship between your creativity and your sexuality? And I remember reading it being like, what? Like, I had such a narrow understanding of sexuality that this idea of like creativity and sexuality, I didn't even understand. I mean, it's like obvious on some level, but I didn't have a sense that the two, because I think we're trained to understand sex and sexuality in such a conventional or societally imposed way that we can't understand it in the realm of like, it's part of this whole structure of our creativity, of our ability to create. And it was really helpful to just read that and be like, gee, because I never create sometimes. And I'm like, what is that? How does that diminishment of my sexual energy then impact the fact that I don't feel like I can create very much? So it helped me understand, it helped me widen the lens. Anyone else? We're good? I mean, there's nothing more to talk about anyway.
We covered the whole
Topic is so small.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you.